We're being live streamed. $125. Okay, so thank you for joining us. Thank you for your patience as people have signed in. On behalf of the Campaign for Peace, Disarmament, and Common Security and Massachusetts Peace Action, I want to welcome you to this evening's webinar, U.S., Russia, China, and NATO, the dangerous new era of great power confrontation and how we respond. I'm privileged to be joined by Hayat Imam as tonight's co-MC. Hayat is a feminist activist who has committed her life work to building global social justice movements in Bangladesh, Indonesia, the Philippines, and the U.S. Her efforts have been directed toward environmental protections, nuclear disarmament, renewable energy, and the economic empowerment of women. Presently, Hayat is an active member of Mass Peace Action's board and active with Dorchester People for Peace. Then, forces that were building prior to Russia's invasion of Ukraine have crystallized in what has been described as a period of acute great power confrontation, Cold War 2.0, and a new ice age. Would that it were simply an abstracted geopolitical arrangement. The Ukraine war has become an extended and very deadly war for the future of Europe. And with Phyllis, I learned last week in a recent discussion with a very senior member of Congress that there continues to be the danger of escalation to nuclear war. Similarly, with China having been named as the primary threat to the so-called rules-based order, and with provocative military actions by the U.S., Chinese, Asian, and European militaries around Taiwan and in the South China and East China Seas, Nancy Pelosi's reckless trip to Taiwan has brought us to the brink of what former Australian Prime Minister Rudd terms, quote, the avoidable war. It is thus critically important for our peace, justice, and climate movements to begin to understand the new and increasingly dangerous geopolitical landscape and to begin developing actions to prevent war and to engage in common security diplomacy. Then to introduce our speakers. Reiner Braun is joining us from New York, where he has been organizing side events and others at the United Nations during the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty Review Conference. Since 1982, he has been active in the peace movement, working in the office of the Krefelder Appeal against new nuclear weapons in Europe. He was the executive director of Scientists for Peace and Sustainability for several years in Germany, starting in 1983. Reiner also worked with the International Network of Engineers and Scientists for Global Responsibility beginning in the 1990s. Since 2004, Reiner has been working with various projects related to the Einstein Year at the Max Planck Institute for the History of Science in Berlin and the Max Planck Society. From 2006 until 2017, he was the executive director of Ilana in Germany, as well as International Ilana. He worked from 2006 until 2012 as the executive director for Vereinigung Deutscher Wissenschaftler, I really messed that up, the German Pugwash Group. Reiner was the co-president of IPB from 2013 to 2019, and he was the main organizer for IPB's World Congresses in Berlin and Barcelona. For many years, he has been one of the speakers of the German peace movement, including being engaged in the campaign against the U.S. Air Base in Ramstein and against NATO. He is the author of several books, including Einstein and Peace, and a biography about the Nobel Peace Laureate, Joseph Rotblat. Truth in Advertising, Reiner and I worked together on the recent IPB Palma Center ITUC Common Security 2022 report, and we spent part of this morning planning for future common security work. Then to introduce Phyllis Bennis. She directs the new international project at the Institute for Policy Studies, focusing on the Middle East, U.S. wars, and UN issues. She is also a fellow of the Transnational Institute in Amsterdam. In 2001, she helped to found the U.S. Campaign for Palestine Rights, and she now serves on the National Board of Jewish Voices for Peace. She works with many anti-war and Palestinian rights organizations, writing and speaking widely across the U.S. and around the world. She has served as an informal advisor to several top UN officials on Middle East issues and was twice shortlisted to become the UN Special Rapporteur on human rights in the occupied Palestinian territories. Phyllis has written and edited 11 books, that's quite a few. Among her latest is the just published 7th updated edition of her popular Understanding the Palestinian-Israeli Conflict. She's also written Before and After U.S. Foreign Policy and the War on Terror, and Challenging Empire, How People and Governments and the UN Defy U.S. Power. More truth in advertising. It's been my pleasure to know and work with Phyllis for more years than she may want to remember. And neither of us are likely to forget making our way through bombardments of caustic tear gas in Strasbourg in 2009 during protests at the NATO summit, which Reiner helped to organize. He organized the protest, not the summit. Following Reiner's and Phyllis's talk, we'll move to a question and answer period. Please post your questions in the chat, and to make seeing those questions easier for Hyatt and me, please let me ask that you keep other comments in the chat to a minimum. So with that, let me turn the floor over to our speakers, beginning with Reiner. Reiner, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Joseph, for this kind introduction, and thank you all for joining this webinar. It's a great pleasure to be with you this evening. And I will try in my 15 minutes to give some ideas how I see the actual situation. Let me start with one point. I think we all should have in mind that we are living in a time of tectonic changes of the international power structures. Or to say it a little bit in easy words, the 500 years dominance of the white man, including the US, is definitely over. So we are living in a time of changes, which means that the old traditional powers, above all the US and the European Union, are losing influence and new powers are becoming much stronger in the world. To show this in some short examples, the G7 today only represents 1/10 of the population of the Earth. The BRICS countries represent 40% of the population of the Earth. Or coming to the GDP, 18% is today the GDP in the world from China, more than the GDP of the US and more than the GDP of the European Union. 20 years before, China has only 4%. Today, they have 15.6 or 16%. And when you are looking back to the situation, even in the beginning of the year 2000, the GDP of China was 1.3 trillion. Today, it is 14 trillion. Or another point, for 128 countries of the world, of 190s, China is the biggest trade partners. The people which are leaving university in the so-called natural science departments are 8 times higher in China than in the US. And the list is very, very long. They continue describing this huge change of power structures. These change of power structures up to now exclude one point. That is the militarization of the world. 60% of the military budget is spent by the NATO countries. This is more than 1 trillion, 1.1 trillion per year. China is spending 225 billion and Russia about 65, 68, maybe 70 billion. So the main military force and the military dominance still is lying in the hands of NATO. And this is the result also again of the NATO summit of Madrid some weeks ago. This NATO summit in Madrid underlined that the NATO countries, above all the US, want to keep the dominance in the world by enlarging their military forces. And they have a huge military program in all the NATO countries. We are not speaking any longer about 2% GDP for military spending in NATO. This is over. I think after the start of the Ukrainian war, all the NATO countries will in the next 1-2 years fulfill the 2% obligations. In many countries, it is much higher. It is not only Germany, which has now, in addition to the 2%, a special fund for the next year, about 100 billion for military. So we have an arms race of the dominant military powers in the world. And NATO, when you speak it in long-term words, is North Atlantic Treaty Organization. This is not any longer true. When we are speaking about NATO, I think we should speak about the military alliance of the world. It not only includes the 32 NATO countries now, when I add Sweden and Finland, and have in mind that with the entrance of Finland to the NATO, there's a new 1,000-mile-long border between Finland and Russia. But also and above all, this includes the strong relations, contract agreements, common exercises, exchange of training, of officers' education, of common strategy conferences between the traditional 32 NATO countries and Japan, South Korea, Australia, and New Zealand. And in addition, new agreements also with Malaysia and Indonesia. This is what we are calling the new global NATO, as the military alliance in the world. This includes the strong relation about AUKUS, as some people are saying this is the new start for the Asian NATO. And these partly include also the alliance Quad, with some critical points because India is not totally engaged in these Western politics. So we are seeing a new militarized bloc of global NATO as the strongest military power in this tremendously exchange of the power structures in the world. And before I'm coming to the consequence of this, let me speak as a European some words to Europe. Europe is a part of the loser. The influence of Europe is declining in the world structure. And the answer of the European Union, above all, is the militarization of the European Union. Europe, this is the dream of the European Union, should become also a military superpower. They are developing new military forces. They are developing independent military structures connected but independently to NATO. They are developing new airplanes. They are developing new marines, and they are modernizing all their arsenals and putting more and more troops to the border to Russia. The second point of Europe is with these, they have still and modernizing the nuclear weapons of the United States in Europe. We will have the new B-6112 coming to Europe maybe in 24, 25. And they are buying from the US the F-35 as the military aircraft carrying these weapons to their goals. So this is very aggressive because these weapons are weapons of attack, and it will definitely have consequences from the other side. But Europe also has a strong discussion about own European nuclear weapons. Up to now, we have only one country in the European Union with such nuclear weapons. This is France. But there is a deep discussion in the elites and in the think tanks about the so-called Eurobomb, which means on the background of the French deterrence, European Union will develop own nuclear weapons for Europe. This means Germany will be a part of this. This is the dream of the German conservatives since many, many years. And the Germans will mainly pay it because for France it will be on the long term too expensive to do this alone. So this is also the danger from the European Union. And the next consequence, and this is strategically high importance, is that the European Union wants to become more autonomous from the United States, more independent as an own superpower. But this strategy was latest with the start of the Ukrainian war given up. The European Union is happy, and above all, the strongest partner in the European Union, which is Germany, are happy to be the main junior partner of the United States, following the rules above all, the militarized rules of the United States. There are economic controversies between both blocs, but in the main strategic orientation against the two new enemies, Russia and China, they are deeply connected, and they are deeply working together. And this is the new bloc, which is called the bloc of the Western values. I'm not discussing in this group about the values. I'm looking to Saudi Arabia and many other countries. Then I have not to discuss about values any longer. I have only to discuss about interests. And the interest of this bloc is to be the dominant partner, the dominant forces in the world with a new job division. European Union is mainly taking care of the rest of Europe, above all of the Balkan countries, and of the northern part of Africa, even of the Sahara zone. You can see the engagement above all of France and Germany in Mali and in other countries in Central Africa. You can see that we again send troops to Bosnia and Herzegovina, that we enlarge our forces in Kosovo because of the critical situation in these regions. So this is also a little bit a new job division. But on the other side, the Europeans are supporting deeply with Marines and politically the encircling of China, mainly done by the United States of America. So we have this new power bloc, which is the European Union and the United States. And they are both supporting the war in Ukraine and Ukraine. No, the Russian aggression against Ukraine creates a lot of new problems. And I'm not speaking in this first round about the peace movement. Maybe I will answer these questions in the discussion, because it definitely creates a lot of very difficult questions and challenges for the European and also for the international peace movement. But I would like to underline by the Ukraine, yes, it was a Russian aggression. It was illegal, but like every war, this war was not falling from the heaven. It has a prehistory. It has a long development, even longer than 2014. And the main point for this development is the NATO enlargement to the east, and that NATO never take into account the security interests of Russia. It always, in the last 30 years, violates the security interests of Russia. So it was not following the lines which were signed with the Paris Charter in 1990 by all European countries from the West and the East, which said we want to have a Europe of cooperation, dialogue, and acceptance, the interests of the other side, and find for compromises when interests are overlapping. These the NATO countries were never doing so. This is a part of the history of this war, and also a part of the history is the deep engagement above all of the United States, but also in Europe, to avoid that Ukraine become a neutral country between the two sides of Western Europe and Russia, which is the traditional role of Ukraine when you are looking a little bit to the history. So that is part of this tragedy which we now have in Europe. And again, this is no excuse for the illegal attack. This is to understand the difficulties and of the situation in Ukraine and how it developed. And I could add many points from the Ukrainian history. Ukraine was never really an independent country. The Ukrainian history is overlapped with the history of Poland, but also the overlap with the history of Russia. It is also overlapped with the history of Habsburg Austria. It has many very critical historical developments. It played a very ambivalent role in the Second World War. Parts of the Ukrainian leaders, of the fascist leaders, were supporting the fascist aggressions. And so it's a very difficult history, which we have to have in mind when we are discussing about the actual situation. Let me summarize with 3 points. First point, I absolutely agree with the doomsday clock announcement of the nuclear weapons scientists, the Nobel laureates, which said we are 100 seconds before midnight. And they have two arguments for that. One argument are nuclear weapons, and the conflict I described for Ukraine and which Joseph described in the introduction to Taiwan is highly dangerous above all because it's a danger for an expansion, for an escalation to a nuclear war. We cannot exclude this. Above all, not in this situation of confrontation in the world. And, and in the nuclear strategies of NATO and Russia, the nuclear weapons are a part of the strategy. So we should be very careful to reduce the danger. For me, the situation is absolutely dangerous. And we should never forget all these fight of the new world order is historically by 2 points in a very specific situation. 1 point are the nuclear weapons. We never had the fight of new world orders, which we historically had very often, in a situation where the countries had nuclear weapons and can destroy the whole planet. And the second point, which was never forgot, is the climate catastrophe and the climate change. We never have such a situation that we have the confrontation situation where we are burning step by step the whole world. And when we are not getting when we are solving the climate change problem, we will have the environmental catastrophe. This is my final point to say to the alternatives. We have alternatives to this. Joseph mentioned in the introduction that the International Peace Bureau, together with the National Trade Unions Confederation and the Olof Palme Center in Stockholm, developed the new Olof Palme Report #2. The main idea of this report is that we have, for solving the global problems, which is hunger, poverty, climate change, and other environmental problems, we need cooperation. And for cooperation and for the background to get to cooperation, we have to overcome this situation of confrontation. So the actions of the peace movement have to concentrate, from my point of view, on 3 points. First, ceasefire and negotiations to reduce the Ukrainian war, maybe to come to a frozen war and open the doors for long-term negotiations. Second, to come to cooperation for opening the door for new cooperation discussing for climate change, but also for solving the sustainable development goals. And third, we need for both, we need disarmament. Without disarmament, we cannot solve any of the global problems of the world. This means we have to reduce dramatically the 2 trillion we are spending for military purposes. And this includes the discussion that we have so quick as possible to get rid of nuclear weapons. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Reiner. Covered a lot there. And now we turn to Phyllis to kind of give us the view from Washington.
Thanks very much, Joseph. And thank you, Reiner, for including so much of what we've all been talking about. It means I can focus on a few other things. But thanks to Mass Peace Action and to the Campaign for Peace, Disarmament, and Common Security for organizing tonight. Thanks to all of you who have worked to put it together. When Joseph first called me some weeks ago about speaking tonight, things at that moment seemed a little bit easier than they seem right now. The Ukraine war was still horrific, and as it remains today, that was the main point to talk about. How did that fit into broader issues in going on in the world? In recent days, we've seen with the assassination of Ayman al-Zawahiri in Afghanistan, the continuation of the U.S. global war on terror. We saw Pelosi's trip to Taiwan escalating significantly the already existing tensions between the U.S. and China. The potential crisis erupting in the Iran nuclear talks, and at the same time in the NPT review that going on at the United Nations. Nothing to write home about, as they say. Is a very important statement from the Secretary General, who said that humanity is just one misunderstanding, one miscalculation away from nuclear annihilation. And we have just in the last 3 days, the continuing Israeli assault on Gaza. While this ceasefire is holding right now, that continuation of the siege of Gaza, the escalation periodically in what the Israelis in their racist language call mowing the lawn, as a way of describing how they view the people of Gaza as grass. All of this is shaping what we need to look at if we're going to understand the world today and to try and change it. Reiner is certainly right that there are tectonic shifts underway around the world, not because there are powerful countries, powerful economically, powerful militarily, trying to dominate other countries, trying to dominate whole regions. That's an old story, that's not new. But one of the things that's different now is that as the world is redividing into blocks, we are missing an ideological basis for how those blocks see each other. We went through the years of the Cold War believing, although it was somewhat exaggerated, that there was a powerful ideological divide between capitalism and socialism, the capitalist bloc, the socialist bloc, and the non-aligned countries who were being fought over by both of those blocs. We don't have that anymore. No powerful country is a traditional socialist country. China still defines itself as socialist, but with what it calls Chinese characteristics, which some of us might say are really capitalist characteristics. The few remaining socialist countries, self-defined socialist countries, are weak, primarily problematic in many ways in terms of human rights issues and others in terms of how their people are living. But what we are seeing is that the category that we're now being told is the main divide in the world is between democracy and autocracy. Now, certainly there are autocratic countries. There are countries that call themselves democratic. How democratic they actually are varies from time to time. But one of the things we're seeing more and more is democratic countries, self-defined democratic countries that do hold elections are electing autocrats. So we have countries that were traditionally heralded as great democracies, India, Brazil, the Philippines, and the United States, all electing autocratic leaders with autocratic cores around them, destroying democratic rights in those countries. Some more briefly, some for longer term, but the blurring between democracies and autocratic practices is becoming very, very serious. When we also look, as Reiner mentioned, when we look at the key allies of the United States, which likes to think of itself as the leading democracy in the world, its key allies, including Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Egypt, a host of the worst autocratic, the worst absolute monarchs, the worst human rights violators in the world, it becomes very hard to see this as a struggle between democracy and autocracy. In this context, militarism is rising all over the world, defined by the wars in new ways of looking at periods of time. You know, we had the Cold War era. Then we had the post-Cold War period of 1991 through the 90s. And then the post-Cold War era ended in 2001 with the aftermath of the 9/11 attacks. We might say that it ended on 9/12, the day that George Bush said that the answer to that horrific crime would be to take the world to war. So then we had the era of the global war on terror, a 20-year war, which has not ended yet. What we're now seeing is that while these power shifts are underway, we're not leaving behind earlier wars. So when the Cold War ended and it shifted to the post-Cold War era, the Cold War was no more. We had the rise of the U.S. as the sole superpower. When the global war on terror began in October of 2001, it left behind the so-called post-Cold War era, which had included a tiny moment of reduced military spending, for one thing. And suddenly military spending took off to fight the global war on terror. Today, when we're looking at a new era of hot and cold wars between the most powerful, dominant, hegemonic powers in the world, the U.S. and Russia, Russia and China, this new shift with NATO right at the center of it on both a regional and a global level, we have not left behind the global war on terror, it turns out. That war is still continuing. And that's different, that's new, where we have the continuation of one era's war, even as we take up new wars in a new in this new period. So in this context, we're seeing a very different situation where the post-Cold War period that ended, we returned to massive militarization, the expansion of US power. The competition with China at that point was primarily economic, much more than military. Russia was actually cooperating with the US during that period, cooperating in Afghanistan, cooperating even with NATO in Libya, voting for
Hi, Marjorie. How are you?
How are you doing?
hello. It might be good if folks could mute their mics.
I've muted that, Phyllis. Go ahead.
Thank you. So we have this very specific shift in the kind of war that the global war on terror is now. We've given up on the reliance on the mass troop deployments in the hundreds of thousands that characterized the early years of the global war on terror. Now there is the reliance instead on airstrikes, drone strikes, special forces. But that war, the strategic nature of that war continues, even as this rising new Cold War, which is unfortunately getting quite hot, is going forward. The economic competition with China is increasingly militarized. We have the consolidation, as Reiner was speaking of, the consolidation of NATO as not only a clear instrument of US power, but operating on a global level. Senator Roy Blunt, a day or two ago, a Republican senator from Missouri, he was talking about the expansion of NATO to include Sweden and Finland. And he said that, and he was quite gleeful about it, he said, this will make it incredibly hard for China to become an Arctic power. And it was like, wait a minute, when did NATO become an Arctic, a Pacific power that's going after China in the Arctic? How does that happen? You know, there's the assumption now of NATO as a global instrument of, quote, the West, with the US in control. So with these shifts underway, the US remains the most powerful hegemonic power on a global level. China is certainly catching up economically. But if you look at the consequence of that, the US tends to rely more on its military power, where it is still unchallenged. The US this year will be spending $847 billion, almost $1 trillion, just the US on its military. Its closest competitor is China, that's only at just barely at 250 billion. So you can see the difference. None of the others even break 100 billion. You know, Russia is at about 65, 68 billion. It's a preposterous reality. So, but that's what we're looking at today. So if we look at the Ukraine war, one of the reasons why the war in Ukraine is so much more dangerous than the wars of the last era, which the global war on terror, which were horrifying for the peoples in the countries in which it was fought, but it didn't have the kind of global impact that we're now seeing from the war in Ukraine. The direct conflict between global powers, the direct conflict between the US and Russia that's going on in Ukraine is what makes this so dangerous. Most importantly, because of the threat of nuclear escalation. Not because I don't actually believe that either Moscow or Washington has any intention of planning or carrying out a deliberate plan for a nuclear escalation. But when you have a war going on between two global powers that are not even talking to each other, that don't even have the kind of tactical deconfliction capacity that they've had, for example, in Syria over the years, where if somebody makes a mistake, they can call it off. They don't even have that. It means that there is a huge danger, not because it's really that big, it's actually quite small. But when you're talking about nuclear weapons, any danger that is not zero is way too big to allow to exist. Richard Falk, who many of you know, who I've had the privilege of working with over many years, has had, I think, a very important and very useful way of looking at the global and local components of the war in Ukraine. He describes it as being two wars going on simultaneously. The ground war, in which Russia was clearly the aggressor, and in which Ukrainians have the right to defend themselves, have the right of national sovereignty, of self-defense, the right of resistance, and a geopolitical war in which the U.S. and NATO have been the aggressors since the end of the Cold War, particularly since 1995, but really since 1991. And it's in that context that we have to look at both. We have to both ensure the right of the people of Ukraine to defend their country, even while recognizing the danger of this geopolitical war in which Ukraine is the ground, it's ground zero of this new war, with the US and NATO as that aggressor. And we've been hearing directly from US officials that the real goal for the US in the war in Ukraine is not to protect Ukrainians, is not to simply give them a better shot at having a better negotiating position sometime in the future, but rather to defeat or contain or weaken Russia. We're also seeing some efforts to contain China in the context of the war in Ukraine. So we have these new regional alliances that are being established, Europe now being defined as we heard from Reiner a minute ago, being defined by its military strength, no longer defined, even if it wasn't really true. Europe tried to define itself as a unified project based on human rights. It was an aspirational thing that people could look towards. It wasn't ever real, it wasn't ever uniformly imposed, but there were elements of it that were there. Now that's not even a talked about claim. Now it's all about how do we strengthen Europe as a global military power, as well as these new alliances that Reiner spoke of earlier. We're hearing an entirely different definition of what international governance should look like. You know, in the 1990s, we had the United Nations at its center, certainly still dominated by the United States. That was when I wrote my book on US domination of the UN. But there was this illusion that the United Nations was both a venue and a player in international affairs and one of the most important centers of how we defined international law. So international law had a real definition. It has things you can look up and say, international law is the Geneva Conventions. International law is the law of the sea. International law is X, Y, and Z. We don't hear anymore about international law. That's not to say it was evenly applied. It never was. It was always about being a more useful tool for the powerful than for the weak. But for the weak, it provided a framework to fight back, and it provided venues to fight back. Now, we don't hear about international law. We hear about this amorphous thing called the rules-based order. And nobody ever says, what are the rules? Who sets those rules? Who has to abide by those rules? There's no clarity, but we know that the rules are set ultimately by the United States. The US says it's a rule that we can kill terrorist leaders anywhere in the world using our military forces, our CIA forces. We can invade and occupy and change the regime in any country we want. We can use what we call over-the-horizon attacks of the old global war on terror. We can use them now and say that that's part of the rules-based order. But no other country can do that. No other country can do that, except perhaps Israel. Maybe the one exception. When Tacitus, the great Roman historian, said 2,000 years ago, he was right. He could have been talking about the United States when he said, the Romans brought devastation and they called it peace. The new version of international law, the rules-based order, is bringing devastation in the name of international law. So the global war on terror is still continuing. We have US troops in Somalia, in Syria. We have special forces in Mali and Niger. But we're combining now the global war on terror with the traditional expansion of traditional wars. We have new US bases being constructed around the world. There's talk of a new US base in Somaliland. There's the clearest example, of course, is the continuation in Afghanistan, where US troops are gone, but the war against terror continues. We saw that with the killing of Zawahiri in an over-the-horizon move just last week. And what we're hearing now is that the changes are not happening everywhere. The Israeli assault on Gaza of the last 3 or 4 days took the mission of Biden's visit to Israel as a message that there would be no pressure on Israel to stop its attacks on the Palestinians. When Biden got there and said, I feel like I'm home, and talked immediately about the need to maintain Israel's qualitative military edge, that we need to pay Israel more than the existing $3.8 billion. Israel was not afraid that there was going to be any kind of a reaction when they went after Gaza again. The result is they can get away with it with admitting that this was a preemptive strike, not even the illusion of claiming falsely, as they have in the past, that it all started, the clock started at that moment when a Palestinian rocket was fired from Gaza, which may in fact be illegal under international law, but takes place in the context of 15 years of the siege of Gaza, completely illegal, completely based on collective punishment, which is thoroughly illegal under the Geneva Conventions. We have global actions without fear of consequence if they are on the side of the United States. At the same time that we're seeing these traditional wars take up more and more threats, at the same time as the global war on terror, we have the new challenge around the Iran nuclear deal. The negotiations have reopened. It's possible that there will be an agreement to sign on, but it's going to be a very, very difficult thing. And we know that the threat of nuclear arms races will be one result that happens however this gets played out, because of the US decision under Trump to walk away from the Iran nuclear deal, and when the Biden administration came in, to decide not to reverse that position as they could have done the day they walked into the White House. The nuclear clock is absolutely right. We are closer to midnight than ever before. So I want to leave with just a couple other points. I think that there are differences in our movement about how to look at the war in Ukraine. There are very few people, I'm glad to say, that are saying that Russia was right, that they somehow had a right to invade and occupy Ukraine. But people have a very different set of views about how much to pay attention to the legacy of the provocations, how much to put them aside, what to hold accountable for members of Congress, all of these questions. And it's not only here. There are differences on these issues all over the world. The non-aligned countries in general are not standing with the US around sanctions against Russia, but neither are they prepared to stand up against the United States. And I think one of the consequences we're going to see of the war in Ukraine is a reluctance, a greater reluctance among those few governments that in the past have been willing to at least talk about engaging with civil society on things like Palestinian rights, on things like the rights of the Rohingya, things like the rights of the Sahrawis in Western Sahara. I think these governments are going to be under much more pressure from the United States not to do that. And they're going to be, as a result, more reluctant. It's going to be more difficult, I think, for us to gain support from governments. The consequence of that, and I will leave us with this, it's the big challenge. The challenge is that our movements that are not nearly as global as they need to be absolutely global in everything that we are fighting for, whether it's fighting against racism, fighting against xenophobia, fighting against Islamophobia, fighting against misogyny, fighting against anti-LGBT moves. All of these things have to be done now on a global level, because increasingly we're not going to find governments as willing to take up these global struggles. The struggle to create a reality for what is now still an aspiration to make nuclear weapons illegal, unacceptable, and gone is going to we're going to have to rely on building social movements so strong that governments will have no choice but to rely on them. It's an enormous challenge for us in this new period. And I would just say that those of us whose work has been primarily in the anti-nuclear, anti-war, anti-empire parts of the movement have an enormous other task, which is to bring all of that information to those movements that are on the rise, particularly here in the United States, the movements against racism, the movements for immigrant rights, all of these movements, not to expect them to come to us, but to go to them, to support their work, to support those movements, to stand with people on the border, to stand with people of color who are fighting against racism and bringing to that fight, as we see with the Poor People's Campaign and others, bringing to that fight the intersection of opposition to racism, opposition to poverty, opposition to climate change, and opposition to militarism, all together. This is the challenge that we face, and it's going to be an enormous one. Thank you all.
Thank you so much to our two speakers. Phyllis, that was really excellent, and Reiner earlier. I'd just like to pose a couple of questions to you, and then try and figure out some questions from the chat. There's so much going on in the chat, it's quite difficult actually. But just to say that both of you have actually pointed out the rising militarization that's going on in the world. And definitely we should be looking at the large picture of the blocks that are emerging. And Reiner, you've said that at this dangerous moment, it's basically cooperation that is needed instead of confrontation. And I'm hoping that we will take that seriously. I have a question which I think we should address, which is about China. We haven't really mentioned China yet, but this is for Phyllis. I was wondering if NATO considers China a challenge to the rules-based order. And yet, China's nuclear arsenal is much smaller than the US. It has signed a no first use agreement since 1964. It doesn't seem to be engaged at the moment in increasing its arsenal. So in some ways, why is it that China is being challenged as denying the world rules-based order of the world? What is behind this, and what rationale is there? Is there a rationale for this?
Well, I think the rationale is that of power. As I mentioned earlier, I think that we are in an era where international law, actual international law that is codified, is not really on the agenda. This rules-based order is a shifting reality depending on what the goal is at the moment. And using it in the context of China, I think is not particularly about China's nuclear arsenal. That's limited to Iran at the moment. We don't hear it, for example, about Israel's nuclear arsenal. We don't even hear much these days about India's and Pakistan's nuclear arsenals. And we certainly don't hear about the U.S. nuclear arsenal as something that is under an obligation of the NPT in Article 6 to move towards full and complete nuclear disarmament. That's not on the agenda. The attacks on China for violating the new rules, these unnamed rules, I think is more because China is flexing its military might using conventional weapons in its own region. It's not acting on a global scale yet, although that certainly may happen. It is certainly acting on a global scale on the economic and political terms. That's what the Belt and Road Initiative is all about. Militarily, it is escalating its presence. It has a new aircraft
military strategies,
that it's putting together.
Yeah.
It has, an enormous military, and it is challenging surrounding countries on issues around definitions of the borders in the water, the law of the sea questions. So there are issues. I mean, I don't see China or Russia, any of these great powers, as well-behaved countries that are progressive and that we should be supporting particularly. However, I think what the US is doing is absolutely exacerbating the situation, not doing anything that could potentially resolve the U.S. China tensions back to an economic challenge. Let them compete with each other economically. Let them compete with each other on who can produce more of the vaccines for COVID and get more of them out to the rest of the world. Who can do it better and faster? If they were competing on that, would be great, rather than competing militarily. But there has become a military aspect to this, not so much around the issue of nuclear weapons, but around the existence of China's conventional forces, which is going on in the South China Sea. Now, the Philippines likes to call it the Western Philippine Sea. There's other definitions as well, but it certainly is closer to China's sphere of influence than it would be for the United States. The problem is the United States doesn't want to acknowledge that China should have a sphere of influence, and it believes that its sphere of influence is the entire world. So that's the challenge that we're looking at right now.
Thank you, Phyllis. I think the shelling at the nuclear power plant is on everyone's minds. And I wonder if, Reiner, you could say something about the fact that Russia seems to have agreed to inspections. What does that mean, and how dangerous is that, really?
Let me say 2 words to the first question. First, that I think we should definitely not use in our discussion the word rule-based order, because this means, for me, the powers who have the countries who have the power are creating the rules. I think we should only use the international law as a basic for agreement and for discussions. And it is absolutely that these countries which were violating international law quite permanently the last years are now creating this rules-based order as a new alternative to international law. And we should be very careful for this. And I have to say, it is maybe at the end, it is really a green war creation created by the green parties, which are using this the most. Above all, our green foreign minister is running around with these words permanently and not any longer using the question of international law, which is for me the basic for international agreements and for international work. Second point, for me, the Ukrainian war is also a pre-war related to the conditions to China. Because with this war, the US and the NATO countries try to weaken Russia, and they weaken the coalition of Russia and China as the alternative bloc to the United States and NATO. And this they are doing quite successfully. When I'm looking to the economic development of Russia, the GDP is -8% this year and an end. So Russia is weaker, not only economically weaker, internationally weaker, because it has a bigger international opposition, and because of it is definitely organizing an aggressive war. And let me say this very clear, because this comes in the chat. When we are speaking about Donbass and Lugansk, and these 14,000 killed people there, first of all, they were killed on both sides along the OSCE data. These are Ukrainians on one side and Ukrainians on the other side. Secondly, the Donbass and Ukraine republics and the fights and the danger and the conflicts around this region never allows another country to occupy an independent country and to try to win a war against this independent country. And what Russia was doing, it was not supporting Donbass and Lugansk, preventing these military attacks from Ukraine. No, it was invading Ukraine. It was flying to Kiev and bombing Kiev and other parts of Ukraine. And this is absolutely violating international law. I absolutely agree with the position of Phyllis saying that Ukrainian are different wars. There's a proximity war. There's the war between NATO and Russia. There's also a war about the influence in the Eurasian region Remember what Brzezinski was writing in his book, who is controlling Eurasia, has controlled whole Asia. And Ukraine is a bridge between Europe and Eurasia. So there are very different elements. And the Western countries really are responsible that this war happened. But this does not exclude in any point the invasion of Russia. I have to say this from my point of view, very, very clear. And we need alternative solutions. We need ceasefire. We need negotiations. And, we had at the end of March, the agreement was quite ready between Ukraine and Russia. Why comes not to power at the end of March? Very easy, because Johnson and the US were saying, Zelensky, continue fighting, you have to win the war, and sending more and more weapons and more money. So, and this is a difficult situation. More weapons makes this war longer and an end. So, and now to the nuclear power plants. First of all, we have in this area 15 nuclear power plants. Not only these two which are now in discussion. This is on one side, Chernobyl, and this biggest nuclear power plant. So, and these power plants shows that Europe in general is not able for any war, because any war can have disastrous consequences. When they are bombing one of these power plants, we will have radioactivity disasters in the whole Central Europe. It will be the same and even more worse than Chernobyl. So this is again an argument for immediately ceasefire and for immediately stopping this war, because this region is really unable to make wars. We have F-85 huge chemical industry complexes in these regions, which in the same will be disastrous when they will be destroyed, and this poisoning chemistry will come to the air. So that's a huge danger. And the visit of the EIO is good, but frankly speaking, the EIO is not a real good organization for controlling nuclear power, because it's too much in favor of nuclear power. Phyllis was speaking about the NPT conference. The boss of the EIO, Rossi, was speaking at this NPT conference, and he was saying one of the biggest successes is now that we have a new discussion about new nuclear power plants in the world. This is absolutely the opposite side. This is not renewable. This is disastrous by resources and an end. So I would be much more in favor when we had UN inspections there, when we had inspections from critical voices from different countries controlling what's happened in these power plants. But I'm very serious, but my trust in EIO is very limited. Also, when I'm looking back to the role of the International Agency was speaking in other conflicts. So it's good that they are going, but we definitely need more and better solutions. And above all, to stop this danger, we need a ceasefire.
Let me jump in here with a question from Moji Aha, initially to Phyllis, but Reiner may also want to comment, which is, can you bring us up to date on the status of the negotiations on the JCPOA with Iran, and how that impacts with the blockification that's taking place? I mean, how does that relate to the emerging structures of confrontation?
Well, I don't have accurate information as of today. The negotiations began on Friday and continued today. I think that the European negotiators have put forward a resolution, a proposed resolution that they say is very similar to the one that was discussed in March, which was close at one point. But the problem is the U.S. has added some additional pressures on Iran and expected Iran to ignore them and go ahead and sign off on returning to the original, some version of the original nuclear deal, leaving aside the additional sanctions, and particularly leaving aside the placement of a unit of the Iranian military, the Republican Guards, on the list of so-called foreign terrorist organizations. There are no other military units of any country anywhere in the world that are placed on that list. It's only this one unit from the Iranian military. And the US position is, we're not going to lift that. Now, the history of that particular set of sanctions, because there are crippling sanctions that are involved with it against both individuals and whole sections of that unit, which it has some political and economic power in Iran, as is true in many cases, in many countries. Parts of the Iranian military control certain aspects of the Iranian economy. So sanctions that are imposed on this one section of the Iranian economy have devastating impact on ordinary civilians. What the history is that Donald Trump imposed that decision, the decision to list that part of the Iranian military on the anti-terrorism list, knowing that it would be a poison pen, as he put it, against any future effort to go back to the deal. When he abandoned the deal in 2018, he said, nobody should ever be able to go back to this deal. I can't stop it if I'm not president, although he didn't admit that he wouldn't be president forever. But nonetheless, he knew that that wouldn't be the case. So he put in place this decision, which he knew would be politically impossible for the next president to reverse it. So there's nothing stopping President Biden from taking that Iranian military unit off the terrorism list, except for his fear that that will get him to be accused of being soft on terrorism, soft on Iran. So he won't do it. So the question is there a way to thread the needle in some way? It could be, there are possibilities. One could imagine saying that a few people from that unit would be kept on the list and others taken off, something like that. Maybe Iran would accept some version of that. I have no idea. But that's going to be a very difficult one. And I think we don't know, nothing is settled until everything is settled on this one. So all these claims that we're very close really don't mean anything until everything is done. It's the last 10% that's always the hardest. The question of how that affects the broader questions, there is a kind of alliance of convenience between Iran and Russia that's been underway for the last decade. It's done terrible things in Syria in particular, where if you look at, for example, the destruction of whole cities carried out largely by Russian planes, along with the Syrian military and supported by Iran, the destruction of Aleppo that went on at almost identical period of time that the U.S. was destroying Raqqa, exactly the same way. The destruction of whole cities that both sides have carried out in this war has led to a continuing alliance between Iran and Russia. But it's not an alliance that's based on shared anything except a willingness to deal with each other, provide weapons, that sort of thing, and opposition to the forces that are allied with the U.S. in general. There's not either a religious or a political or some other linkage between the two countries. So it's an alliance of convenience, primarily. I see you disagreeing, Reiner, but I'm saying that in general, I think it's one that is not necessarily a strategic alliance that will last forever. It lasts as long as there's a value to it in terms of sharing information, sharing intelligence, and crucially, sharing weapons. So that's what's going on now.
And oil and gas.
There is the oil and gas aspect, but right now, that's playing out on an emergency basis. That's certainly true right now in the midst of these sanctions. In general, both of these countries are exporters of oil and gas, and they don't need each other as much as they do. They're both part of OPEC Plus that moves that forward. But I don't know that that is enough to keep that alliance going. I think the only question, and I'll stop and let you take it over, Reiner, if you have a different view, if the negotiations succeed and there is an end to these crippling sanctions against Iran and an end to Iran's current position of moving forward on enriching uranium at a much higher level than it had been. It didn't do that immediately when the U.S. pulled out of the agreement, but over time it said, look, if you're not going to abide by this, we're not going to either, essentially. that could be reversed. Both of those things would be very, very important. One on the level of eliminating a potential nuclear arms race in the region and beyond, and the other in terms of providing crucial medicines and food for people in Iran who have been really suffering from these sanctions.
Thank you, Phyllis. Here's a question. There's a couple of questions actually about power dynamics in Europe. This one is from Sahan Yilmaz. She says, will Germany's armament mean the decline of American influence in Eastern Europe in the future, given Germany's economic strength, since Germany would be expanding its influence within NATO? So there's one. And the other one was, did US, France, UK, Germany push Sweden and Finland to join, or were there internal forces in those two countries that made them join NATO?
Okay, let me say one sentence to Iran. When Phyllis described what is needed, that there will be a new agreement or the revitalization of the old agreement, I think you can see how difficult it will be that it will come to power. After listening to the speeches of the last week at the UN, I'm very much in doubt that there will be an agreement, because the controversies between all these countries are so deep, and the mistrust is so deep that I will not say cannot see, but I have many doubts that there's this new round in Geneva with a new suggestion of the European Union, which is at the end a revitalization of the old suggestion, will bring a new situation for Iran. I have really doubt, the whole international atmosphere speaks for me against such an agreement now. And, I'm also in doubt if Biden has the power for the internal discussion about such an agreement against the Republicans. So I'm very much have many doubts that there will be a new agreement. But only one point to the interest of Iran, Russia and Iran developed, from my point of view, a strategic coalition, or the strategic coalition. This will definitely never forever, but for the next period of this confrontation, they have enough common interests to overcome the sanctions by developing new partners and new cooperation in the industry, and above all by gas and oil. And the key point is the transportation. And I think Russia offered that the Iranians can use the oil pipelines, and they will build new oil pipelines to the Russian oil pipelines going to China, and that Rosneft and other Russian companies also signed an agreement for building a new pipeline from Iran to China. So this is big common interest, because this means to overcome the sanctions. And I think for Russia and for Iran, a question of survival is how they can develop economic relations to so many countries as possible, and are not in danger of these sanctions. That is a key point. And also don't forget that they start to make all their trade agreements in their national bank and national accounts, so that they are not any longer using dollars for any transaction. So I can imagine, not only with Iran, but with some other of these countries, including China, that this will be a more or less strategic cooperation, maybe to be cautious for the next years, as an alternative bloc to the NATO bloc. Answering the questions to Germany, the decision of the summit was to expand the troops at the border, above all the Baltic countries and in Poland, from 40,000 to 300,000. This means a lot of new NATO troops will come to the border to Russia. This means the U.S. troops will still keep. There were even some more troops, but the main responsibilities for this big amount of new troops is lying by the European partners of NATO, and there Germany has definitely a specific responsibility to send more troops to these countries. Up to now, we have only troops in Lithuania, but we will also have in the near future troops in Romania, Bulgaria, and Estonia. So definitely there will be a new burden sharing. This means there will be new troops, but there will be no reduction of US troops. Even there are coming new US troops to Europe. They enlarge the US troops in the military bases in Germany, above all the military bases in Ramstein. So Biden changed the development of Trump to reduce the troop tremendously. There are no more new troops. There are more new US weapons, above all new aircrafts in Europe. So it's a new burden sharing, but this burden sharing means more power by the Europeans, but no reduction of the power by the US. Sweden and Finland. You know, what you were asking the question is not an alternative. First of all, we should never forget that in reality, in political reality, Sweden and Finland were parts of NATO since 2014. They were taking part in all NATO summits. They were taking part in all NATO decisions over these years. They were a part of all NATO exercises. US and NATO troops could use the airports and the harbors of Finland and Sweden since 2014. So it is something definitely new when they are also formal members of NATO, but they were a part of the whole NATO infrastructure since 2014. So that is definitely not totally new, but it is on one side, the Social Democratic parties were using the Ukrainian war and the change of the public opinion for going these steps to be a formal member of NATO. So maybe there, at the end, there was not direct power from the US. That was not needed because both countries want to join, or the majority parties from both countries want to join. In Finland, this includes not only the Greens, but this also includes the Left Party, which was in the majority for joining NATO. In Sweden, it was in opposition to the Left Party, but with the support of the Green Party. And I have not to tell you that all conservative parties were in favor of it. So it was at the end what I'm always calling what Noami Klein is writing about shock therapy. I think they were using this shock therapy about the aggression of Russia to fulfill that they really want to fulfill since years, and they were using the chance to do it now.
So I'd like to exercise the co-chair's prerogative of asking a question here, which I'd like to ask of Phyllis. It seems that we're in a situation where the Democratic Party in Congress has definitely become a war party. Not that it was pacifist in the past, but as we're looking at the almost total and unquestioning support for really the defeat of Russia in Ukraine and for the new Cold War confrontations with China. And so my question is, can you share with us what you know about the tenor of discussion, where the Democrats are, and where you see any potential openings and how we might take advantage of them?
Oh, you ask a hard question, Joseph. Not in terms of it's difficult to answer, but it's a hard one to hear. It's a hard one to know. The Democratic Party has always been a war party. I think if we look at whether it was Johnson in Vietnam, whether it was, I mean, we don't have to go through the whole litany, but Obama in the global war on terror was not different. It was really not different. I think there is a difference now when we are seeing the discussion of a return to this. It's a much more frightening discourse to talk about great power conflicts than to talk about the global war on terror, which is always against smaller, weaker countries, generally brown and Muslim, in fact. It's not about a conflict of equals or even remotely close to equals. So I think that one of the things that we see with the Democrats that's different and very disturbing is a much bigger grasp and excitement almost about the kind of anti-Russia and we were seeing it earlier with an anti-China focus, kind of a set of assumptions and almost hysteria about everything Russian, all of the stuff about Russian poets and Russian novelists and Russian composers being kicked out. You know, there were here in DC, there's 2 Russian restaurants that had bricks thrown through their windows. You know, this notion of not just a potential military battle over territory, but that an entire country is somehow not acceptable anymore. And I think that the fact that it happened so quickly is both a reflection of, for a lot of people in the Democratic Party and a lot of people in this country, certainly plenty of Republicans, most of them, Russia has always been the Soviet Union, and it still is. They still see it as an existential enemy, an existential danger. Now, we do have members of the Democratic Party, obviously based in the Progressive Caucus, that have been against military budget escalations, have been against militarism. Most of them have voted for the support for Ukraine. Yeah. For some, for many, it's a pragmatic recognition. This is not a fight worth having because it's a losing fight. Sometimes you wage a losing fight to make a principled point. But on this one, I think many of them decided it was not going to be worth it, that they were not going to be able to make a principled point. They were just going to be attacked. And it certainly wasn't going to pass. So there was no, so I think that was part of it. I think for others, there was a recognition that for some, we have to understand the Progressive Caucus has never been as progressive on international issues as it is on most, not all, but most domestic issues. The Progressive Caucus is self-defined. Pramila Jayapal, who's been the chair this year and has done an extraordinary job of holding that caucus together in a very difficult, challenging period, tried early on to set some ground rules that basically said that to be a member of the caucus, you had to vote a certain number of times with the majority caucus position, or you would lose your position in the caucus, essentially. But that didn't ever really happen, and it was never imposed on international issues. So plenty of people in the Progressive Caucus have never been progressive on any foreign policy issues. And they don't see that as a contradiction because the Progressive Caucus itself has rarely taken up foreign affairs. So it's a big contradiction. Foreign policy has always been seen in the US as something that is supposed to be bipartisan. It's supposed to reflect the reality that partisanship stops at the water's edge. And what that means isn't clear. Like, does that mean that you're supposed to just support the president, whoever she is, whoever he is, whatever party they may belong to? Well, that never happens. But I think that's kind of what it's come to. So I think there's no secret to it. It's just much harder. I was at an event with a number of members of the Progressive Caucus, I guess about a month into the Ukrainian war. And there were questions, and one of the questions asked was, what can we in civil society be doing that would help progressives challenge this constant militarization as the only answer and move towards focusing on the need for a ceasefire and a diplomatic solution? And there were about 5 members of the caucus who were there. And as I recall, at least 3 of them literally threw up their hands like this. They didn't just metaphorically, they physically threw up their hands and said, we don't know, we don't think it's possible right now to challenge this. The question was also raised about how can we keep the focus on cutting the military budget? And the answer was, in this moment of providing arms and military support to Ukraine, we don't think it's possible. It wasn't like you need to do this, you can push on this. So, the challenge is we have to continue. We have to continue on the basis of principle. The US military budget is a crime. Wherever the money is, whether it goes to buying new F-35s that explode on the runway, or whether it goes to buying new ships that are great because they're providing new jobs. It is a crime that we are spending $847 billion on the military budget. This is the lesson we take from Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who said that every bullet, every gun, every bomb is taken out of the mouth of a hungry child, is taken from the coat of somebody who is cold, is taken from a home for someone who is homeless. So I think that's the message for us that we have to keep in mind. We have champions in Congress, but they are not the leaders of our movement. We have to lead our own movements, and we will push them to do better.
Thank you very much, Phyllis. I do want to bring up one topic that did not come up, which is the perspective of the global South. I think sometimes I'm from Asia myself, and sometimes it seems like we're spectators watching these big powers in Europe and U.S. just fighting it out, and we are going to feel the effects of it. So I think we should talk a little bit about the Western sanctions, which are basically, it's an economic war that will definitely have implications in Europe, but it's the rest of the world, the global South, that's going to be experiencing poverty and cold and hunger and starvation, basically. So my question really is, yes, that's going to happen possibly, but I'm really looking at what the potential might be for this extreme lack of security that people are going to be experiencing. Is there a possibility that this could become a wake-up call for the world, or would it turn more towards common security as the answer, or is it just going to lead to more violence? So Reiner, maybe you could take this one.
You know, the countries which are as really no responsible for these wars are suffering the most from the war. This is the South. I think Oxfam 2 or 3 weeks ago said that since the war starts, more than 100 million people are coming to hunger. And in addition to these 800 million we have, which are going with hunger to bed. So, and the same is where all these inflation, the new prices for oil and gas, the South is suffering the most. And the South needs to create more independent politics. And the interesting point is, I think Phyllis mentioned it, 3/4 of the countries in the world are not supporting the sanctions because they know why, because they are the victims of the sanctions. And they know what is colonial structures and the consequences of that. So U.S. Biden and their guys, and also the German Scholz and the Europeans were traveling around the world. They want to convince Senegal as the chair of the African Union. They wanted to convince India, please join the sanctions. The answer was clear no. And my hope is that with this Ukrainian war, we will have a revitalization of the non-alliance movement as an independent political force in the world. Independent definitely from the Western of the NATO countries, but maybe are also a little bit independent from the BRICS countries. We will also have a stronger role of the BRICS countries in the world. And maybe we'll have 1, 2, or maybe even 3 new BRICS countries. No one knows what will be with Nigeria, which will be with India, maybe Indonesia. Argentina definitely will join BRICS, maybe Iran will join BRICS. So the BRICS countries will be stronger, and hopefully the non-alliance countries will be stronger. And only these power can stop the development that the South is suffering. And please have in mind that the suffering is not only the social suffering, it is also the climate suffering. Because these countries which have really no responsibility for climate change are suffering the most under the climate change conditions. And so I hope that we will have in the new future new alliances and coalition of the victims of these changes, mobilizing and arguing and acting against these politics. So, because this means to overcome the neo-colonialistic structures which we still have in the world. So this is a hope, But I think there are the chance that with these consequences of the sanctions that we will have new developments in the south of the world and hopefully new opposition to it. And when I'm listening on Joseph, I think was this too, when listening a little bit to the speeches at the UN NPT conference, there were very, very many very critical speeches to these that argument that these countries must be more independent from NATO and the United States, developing their own politics, not only against nuclear weapons, but also for their social and ecological interests.
If I could add just one point on the BRICS, I think that it's no longer a category that has much meaning given the government shifts that have gone on in Brazil, in China, in Russia, in India. It's most of the BRICS, with the exception of South Africa, perhaps, are really becoming quite authoritarian. So I don't think it's a very useful category to be looking at. I think the question of real non-alignment is going to come from different countries than have been true in the past. I know it's getting late, but.
Yeah, this could go on. This has been really wonderful, presented sobering and illuminating information. I do thank you both so much for bringing up these to the table. And I also thank all the people who've joined us. I really regret that we couldn't get to every single question. There were some really good ones there. I want to just quickly ask Joseph if you have a last word before I close it.
I don't know that I have much of one, except to say that I sort of wish we had spoken a little bit more about the U.S. China confrontation, which I think is increasingly dangerous. And I think this is a really excellent webinar. It kind of begins us into a discussion. The world is changing. Our peace movement has to change as well. And just to thank everybody, and to thank Cole and our hosts at Mass Peace Action as well.
I do want to thank again everyone who's joined, and just remind you that you know, if you found this interesting and exciting, and obviously we have more to say, so there'll be more of these. We'll carry on. Please, if you're not already members, please join us. I would urge you to look into Campaign for Peace, Disarmament, and Common Security, your host today. And we also hope you'll keep in touch with them through the cpdcs.org link, cpdcs.org, if you want more information. And our co-host and our sponsor today is Mass Peace Action. So Mass Peace Action is your very own peace group in Massachusetts. So please join us also. Volunteers are needed for a whole range of actions, from anti-war to legislative work. For information, you can go to masspeaceaction.org. And again, I want to thank the speakers for their time, for their thoughtfulness, and hope to see you all again soon.
Thank you, Hayat.
And Phyllis and myself will continue our discussion about BRICS.